Welcome to the Probability Podcast. Discussions on emerging and converging technologies, problems that are being solved, and the probability of positive and negative outcomes that we might expect. Now, please welcome your hosts, Jason, the generator Spracklin, and Patrick, the discriminator Lozon.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Probability Podcast.
This episode is part of a special trilogy on the next great exploratory horizon of our planet, the ocean. We are entering a pivotal era where the abyss is becoming a space for expansion of high-tech, autonomous navigation, sub-ocean habitats, and high-stakes deep-sea mining. Across these 3 episodes, we'll examine how we are mapping the unknown, learning to live at extreme pressures, and navigating the massive economic and environmental risks.
In the second episode of the trilogy, we're diving into the future of human habitation on and under the waves. From high-tech underwater research stations to massive floating cities, the race is on to combat rising sea levels and establish a permanent presence on the continental shelf. We'll dive into the transition from legacy platforms like the Aquarius reef base to the next generation of modular undersea habitats. We'll also break down the tech making these programmable science factories possible, from 3D printing robotic arms and advanced bioreactors to the complex life support systems required to keep researchers safe at crushing depths. We'll also dive into the transition from temporary research outposts to permanent residential hubs, like the massive 1-mile-long Freedom ship and the automated industrial floating city of Oxidation. We'll discuss the psychological toll of living in a steel bubble, the engineering hurdles of extreme ocean pressure, and the complex reality of building tax-free societies in international waters. Join us as we dive into how ocean tech is reshaping where and how we live, the risks of deep-sea autonomy, and what it takes to survive in the world's harshest environment. So Patrick, is the sea a refuge from the tyranny of land, or is it just a different kind of cage?
The sea is vast and unknown.
Yes. Yeah. That one was from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Yeah,
if you remember, that was originally a book and then a Disney movie from many
I do. I have
ago.
the original book on it. The thing about the 20,000 leagues is the ocean is. There's 2 pieces to the ocean. There's the abyssal, plains, and they're 6,000 meters to 13,000 meters. They're pretty deep anyway. The average depth is at least, I think, 3,700 meters, or around 4,000 meters. So that's pretty deep, right? And if you look at different areas of the oceans and different oceans, you'll have deeper spots, of course, the different trenches and like underwater canyons, right? But what we do have is we have the continental shelf, right? So they vary and they basically come out from the shoreline out, maybe 10 miles, maybe a mile, maybe 25 miles, maybe 30, 40, 50, 60 miles. It really is I should be saying this in kilometers, but the idea there is that it's a geological plate formation, right? As it tails off, and then there's this big cliff at the end, right? And it drops down into the, basically the ocean plates, and that's where you get your 4,000 meter depth. So that water on the on this continental shelf is roughly under 200 meters, maybe 180 to 200 meters deep, an average, right?
It's the same kind of idea of when you were swimming in the ocean, or maybe even in a lake. I can't remember. When I was growing up, I remember you would basically you'd be swimming and you'd be able to sort of touch the bottom, right? You were within range of the bottom. I remember being in a lake, or maybe it was swimming in the ocean, where you're walking out, and then all of a sudden you just drop off to where you're not going to touch the bottom, where it's like the really depth of the body of water.
Yeah,
you're
and it does that at a grander scale, right? Like once the continental plate drops off, it's basically fairly sudden rupture, and down you go, right? But the idea here is that 200-meter depth, the average depth around the different continents, and like I said, they vary in thickness, but the idea is that that's where all the life is, right? That's basically the sunlight can penetrate down that deep. Basically sunlight can penetrate down to approximately 1,000 meters, but 1,000 meters, what does that really mean, right? I mean, if you're at 1,000 meters and looking up, you'd say, oh, it's a little bit of light coming up, right? But as you get closer and closer, you'll see it's brighter and brighter, right? So at 200 meters, you have your coral reefs, and you have all the the extreme biodiversity we have today, and with that, that's where if you're looking at to study anything scientifically, right, that's our area of interest. So the 200-meter depth is it's not that's not, I wouldn't call that shallow.
No, not quite.
Right. I think you have to, was it 56 meters or something like that? Once you get below that, I mean, you're into developing the bends and that kind of thing. If you're not careful, right? You have to actually go into lowering your oxygen saturation, right?
No, of course, yeah.
You're changing your mix, right? The heliox or whatever. You can't breathe, like every time you get every meter you go down, it's getting I have to look at that specific rate here, but basically the pressure is growing, right? So
yeah, it's like when you're diving, you can't just come up from a really from a depth immediately, right? There's that pressurization. There's a whole thing with deep sea divers where they have to kind of slowly come up, and their body if they come up too fast, essentially they can die, right? Because you're coming from a deep pressure on the body to that lighter pressure, which is sort of what you're trying to describe there, right?
Yeah, you get nitrogen bubbles and build up in your bloodstream and into your joints, and having the bends. Case of the bends is extremely painful. The other side of it, of course, is that you get convulsive, and your joints can freeze up, and essentially you can't swim, right? So yeah, it's not a. Never mind what it's doing to your brain.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the challenge of living underwater in general, I guess, right? So this idea, I mean, we're talking about habitat. We're talking about habitats on the ocean or under the ocean, right? And there's sort of two ideas around that, but that's why it's so not just complex to explore the ocean like we talked about in the first episode, but also like living on the ocean. It's very unforgiving and inhospitable in many ways, right? We weren't sort of conceived or we didn't evolve to live. Maybe we came out of the ocean as a blob or as an amoeba, but we certainly are not engineered to live, at least not to live under the sea. I guess in some ways we're able to live on top of the sea. There's that whole concept of having sea legs, and many people live even many months, right? Either on ships or on oil rigs or what have you, right? So there's certainly an element of that we're able to partake in, but by all means it's certainly a different frontier for us, right?
Yeah, I personally came in as a shark with legs. That's right. Yeah, so
why am I not surprised?
Yeah, I had attitude, so they stayed away from me. The giant dinosaurs and such. So as we talk about the idea of living in the ocean, we are out of our element. We're not used to the pressure of the water. We're not used to the temperature of the water. It's, of course, cold, right? Now, if you go down, roughly 3,000 meters, the water's, 0, 3 degrees, what have you. But the idea being that, we're talking about that 200, meter continental shelf sweet spot, right? That's that's where it's practical. That's their target, right? For building these, deep sea study areas, right? And also, if you look at it from a point of view of, and we'll get into this a little bit on our habitats, is that, going down, I don't know, 13 to 50 meters. I mean, that's really, an area where you're able to have, roughly, we'll call it, aquarium type of habitats, right? You're not really deep sea, right? Well, maybe 50 meters, yeah, but between 10 and 20 meters, and this is where you see, we'll get into the hotels and stuff that they're building underwater. So it's interesting from a point of view of having that capability to go down under the water and enjoy the sights underwater, but also through that acrylic, be able to see the shark come up, but it can't bite you.
Yeah, experience it, right?
Yeah.
You see that in some of the aquariums. They've got a giant Ripley's aquarium in Toronto, right? And then obviously this is like a man-made kind of structure. When you go there, you're essentially, they built it so that you're kind of walking through the sea, right?
Yeah.
There's an area where it's almost like a tunnel, and you have these giant sharks there just swimming above you, so you're sort of within their environment, but you're encased within this like tube, right, inside this glass tube, and it's quite the and a lot of aquariums are built like that, right, where you kind of go down into the aquarium and you're looking at the the sea life in its sort of, well, I guess unnatural habitat, but it's built to seem like a natural habitat. It is quite fascinating because you don't normally get to experience that unless you're going to become like a scuba diver or what have you, or go down in a submarine, as it were, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think the idea here, though, is we're going to be talking about sub-ocean, like going underneath the ocean, and we're going to talk about kind of the floating cities, the whole approach about being able to. And this is like, I don't know. Did you ever watch Waterworld?
Yeah, many years ago.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, apparently that set it actually plunged down to the bottom of the lake or the ocean or wherever. A few times they had some problems keeping it afloat, but
when they're filming it.
Yeah, so hopefully these new versions aren't quite as bad.
Yeah, the one thing I remember about Waterworld was it was one of the, if I'm not mistaken at the time, I think it was one of the most expensive movies ever made.
Right.
And it was also combined with one of the worst cinematic flops in history. So like they spent whatever it was in that day, right? Like over $100 million, which was a lot more back then. And it really flopped, but they had pinned a lot of hopes on it with Kevin Costner and other actors. But that's kind of the thing I remember, that it was an interesting concept, but I remember the controversy around like how much it cost versus it just, that's what you just don't know when you create a work of art, right? Conceptually it can seem great, but then it doesn't all come together in the way you want it to, or audiences just don't enjoy it in the way you want them to enjoy it, right? So it's
and there's some nonsensical stuff in there, right? I mean, at the beginning of the scene of the movie, and the guy pees into this elaborate filtering system, and he, basically, I don't know, pumps it or something, and out comes fresh water, right? And then he drinks it. But why would you do that? Why did you just take some of the salty water? If it can clean pee, why would you, why don't you just take some cleaner, ocean water and put it in there, right? So there's some nonsensical stuff in that movie for sure.
It's less salty, that's why.
Yeah, there's a lot of little hidden poisons in there. That's why your body's getting rid of them, right?
Yeah. So where are we starting here? Are we starting like
undersea
under the water, like in undersea bases, like this Aquarius Reef base?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah, so the idea is NASA is in cahoots with this Florida International University, and they have this pretty impressive research station. It's 62 feet deep, right? So the idea being, it's getting into a higher level of pressure there. The idea there is you're not going you're going to have to scuba dive down to that 62 feet down. You have to be a fairly good, diver. The idea there is you're down there. You're on a level of the continental shelf. It's not exactly 200 meters, but you're able to perform a lot of biological monitoring and exploration. But there's some other very interesting ones. There's the Jules Undersea Lodge, which was originally a research station, and they turned it into a underwater hotel, which you have to scuba dive to it, but it's only it's like 22 feet down.
Okay, yeah.
So it's not really deep. However, for the average scuba diver, going down that depth, and then you go underneath it to come up, and it's for the average person that hasn't had a lot of training and diving, that they are guided, right? They have an experienced diver guide you down, and once you get in there, it's a little dated, right?
So in the document that we use, to kind of corral our research, there's a few pictures of this undersea hotel, right? And there's a picture of a guy with a pizza. So what's the story behind that? Are some guy bring a pizza into the hotel through the water?
Well, that's right. Well, you got to have supper. You can stay there they usually stay there overnight. It's a 16, 15-hour thing, right? So the idea is you go down there, you have some quiet time. I mean, what are you going to do? It's not a lot of square footage, right? But they'll bring you down, your meals. You get that breakfast and
you
supper.
can't cook down there. Like everything has to be delivered. Is that the idea?
Yeah. There's these waterproof, suitcases and bags and everything, and they shuttle food back and forth for you. There's snacks, and there's a fridge there. And they also have a full functioning bathroom. The whole shooting match. So you can be comfortable there, but it's not high tech, right?
Yeah,
and
so you have to give the tip the Uber Eats guy a lot to bring a pizza down. As a scuba diver, right?
Well, that's the guy, yeah.
Pizza.
Now this is a standalone. This is a standalone thing, right? It's unlike some of these other ones that we'll talk about with the hotels and that, where you just descend down staircase or an elevator and you're underwater, right? These are, you actually got to dive down to see it, right? So there's another one called Marine Lab, and again, it's more about research and education, and you're not down there for a large amount of time, so it's not we'll call it a full-fledged facility, right? The other shallow units we're talking about here are the hotels in the undersea rooms there. Now, first one that we've got was from the Palm, Dubai. It's the Atlantis suite, right? To stay there, it's only 10 to 25K per night.
Oh, that's all. Okay.
Yeah.
That's pocket change.
Yeah, that's right. And you go to the bedroom, and you're basically there's this hotel. This part of the hotel is submerged down into the lagoon, and then the lagoon's been turned into this big aquarium, right? So they've collected all these forms of sea life, and so it's a little denser than it would normally be. Lots to see down there. It's quite amazing. There's the Manta Resort in Tanzania. It's only 1,500 to 5K a night. So that to me is a deal.
Oh,
right?
Cheaper, yeah. But that's just like a room just sitting just below the surface. It's interesting concept, but it's not like being like really deep under the sea, right? So it's
right.
But I imagine there's still a fair bit of technology involved, right? With any of these in terms of handling some of the pressure and the glass used and all those technologies to even whether it's just something sitting just below that you don't have to dive to or not. There's still a lot of similar technology to just even having a vessel to explore, right? It has to be safe to some extent, right, for people to spend extended times down there for sure.
Yeah, and like the Maldives one, for instance, which is 15 to 25K a night. Your bedroom is basically under a dome of, it's more of a cylinder, but of acrylic glass. And it's funny. There's a red button you can push, right? It's an emergency button. It's like an emergency alarm. But on the other side, like basically we come in on one side, and on the other side of that cylinder, in the roof is this. Basically, you pull this staircase down, and you can run up the staircase, right? And you essentially end up in this little area that juts out of the ocean.
Oh, okay.
Like, a turret of a submarine, right? So you end up, so it's an emergency escape, just in case you spring a leak, right?
Pretty quick, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But personally, why don't you just run up the staircase, right, into the other part of the hotel? But I guess you can't, right? I guess that's the idea.
I get the novelty of it and the experience of it for sure. I mean, I've been at an aquarium type thing, but my mind kind of goes back to the fact that you're going to sleep somewhere there, and then at some point during the night you're going to wake up and open your eyes, and you're going to have like a manta ray or a shark like staring at you through the glass, or an octopus or something. It might be just a little bit unsettling, perhaps, right? I guess that's all part of the experience in the end, but it's kind of interesting, the kind of things we put ourselves through to kind of experience things out of the box, right?
Yeah, I mean, even at 20, 30 feet, it gets pretty dark, right? The light saturation. So a lot of these places have a number of different artificial lighting that's on at night, so you can see what's going on down there. And to tell you the truth, fish have cycles too. There's nocturnal life, and there's life that basically is an abundance during the day, and then they all find their little places to hide. And so it really does depend on how there's not as much to see at night, if you could see it in the first place. Right. Oh yeah, one other thing we didn't talk about in Maldives is you can go down there for underwater to eat for a restaurant, so you can go down there and eat. Right?
Do they serve seafood there?
They serve
eat
many
your
kinds.
Seafood while you're watching seafood swim around type thing.
That's right. Yeah.
That's just mean to the fish, though. Like, the fish are just swimming around. They're looking into this glass dome and watching you eat their friends.
In a way,
these humans, man, they're a real piece of work, eh? They're not bad enough they're eating our friends, but then they set up a dome in which we can watch them eat our friends. So I don't know.
It is kind of sick when you frame it that way,
That's what we do here on the Probability Podcast. Think about wild and wonderful ways to look at the wild and wonderful world.
It's all about your perspective. Yes. Yeah.
This is true.
So let's get into a little bit deeper, right? So now we're looking at things, 60 feet and under, right? So the Proteus is what it's being led by Fabian Castor, right? So, or Cousteau, I should say. Remember Cousteau, very famous name.
Jacques Cousteau.
Yeah, very famous name, and basically underwater exploration, right? So he's basically called this the ISS of the ocean, right? And so it's in the construction phase, right? So the idea is going to have up to 12 people living there, actively living there, day in, day out. And the idea is it's basically a research station, but it's going to be able to facilitate the full needs of the staff. So, you're going to have hydroponic gardens. You're going to be able to have, state-of-the-art wet and dry labs. You're going to have permanent multi-level homes for the scientists. So it is in a situation where there, a lot of design and a lot of proof of concept of building is being done today on it. We've got roughly, I don't don't have a specific delivery date on that, but it's a few years away yet. The other one
it's
that
basically like the sorry, I was going to say the so if you look at this, like you mentioned ISS earlier, but for those that don't know, it's the equivalent of an international space station underwater, right? So it's sort
exactly.
of think about underwater like a base to do research and exploration from, right? That's kind of like the idea there. So it's think about the same type of habitat but underwater. I think it's similar to if you look at space travel, but more importantly, when people spend extended times on the in the International Space Station, for example, or in any space station, and then they finally come back to Earth. Now it's probably a little bit different that they're living in, a zero gravity type atmosphere, but there's definitely a lot of impacts to the human body there, right? And perhaps we'll get into that a little bit later. But just thinking in terms of, we've had people that can go in these sort of, lower depths of water, right? And live in some of these habitats for short periods of time. Now we're getting into deeper and deeper habitats. Do we really even know what the impact is when they live down there for an extended period of time? If you look at, I remember when the Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield was at the space station for one of the longest periods that anybody had been there, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But either way, he was there for an extended period of time. I mean, when he came back in the capsule, he had to be lifted out of the capsule. His muscles had sort of wasted away, right? And his body wasn't used to gravity, and he was just so weak that he sort of came back in this emaciated state in some sense, that when there was no gravity and that he didn't notice it when he came back. It had this huge impact. And I seem to remember watching an interview with him, or maybe it was his book, where he just talked about it. Even once he was back, it took him a while to get rehabilitated to sort of function like normal in Earth's gravity. So I would imagine that there's some sense of that issue, or some semblance of that issue, with sort of, let's just say that someone did spend an extended time, like months, living underwater. What would that impact be on them when they come back to the land, I wonder, right?
Yeah, I mean, bottom line is it's decompression sickness is not something to be played with. I mean, you get at the minor mild stuff is you have really sore joints, and your lymphatic system is not working properly, your skin is a little itchy, but it can go very severe very quickly and affect your nervous system, affect your brain, affect your spinal cord, your lungs, your musculoskeletal system. It's potentially fatal, right? So I mean, the idea here is that it has to be managed, those pressures, and when you're going down to 200 meters, the intent of all of these habitats is to ensure that the scientists and researchers are comfortable. So the idea is keep them at one atmosphere. So if they do have to go, to exit from that and pressurize, then of course, you're going to have to, at that point, have that decompression capability within the module as well, so you can bring them back, right? You can bring people back safely. So that's essentially a process which nobody ever talks about, which is it's like you can hear sound in outer space, in Star Wars, right? You can't, right? There's no sound. Sorry. Right.
Well, that's the whole line from the movie Alien, right? Or the movie Aliens, where it's like, in deep space, no one can hear you scream. I think
that's right.
The quote from that movie type thing.
Yeah.
That sounds fun.
But the thing is, not too deep, right? Not too deep.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah. But then there's other interesting effects on the human body, right? There's the whole, see, if you were living, sort of very deep, when you talked about the shelf and going beyond where the sunlight doesn't penetrate, right? Then you're living without a daylight cycle, right? You don't get those circadian rhythms,
that's
for
right.
example, right? And that you can suffer from sleep disorders and so on, which is kind of interesting because in a sense, I remember when I was very young, I got a job at a warehouse, like a distribution warehouse, and I was essentially working nights, so I had to sleep during the day, which really throws things off quite a lot, right? And to the
Yeah.
point where in order to sleep, I had to black out my windows, which I remember doing at the time with tinfoil, because no light doesn't get through tinfoil, right? Um, Kind of weird to be living in a small apartment where the windows and patio doors are blacked out by tinfoil, but there was a coping mechanism to have to sleep during the day, right? And just curtains and that wouldn't cut it. And I remember that just being definitely taking a toll on me of not spending most of my time, awake in darkness, and spending most of my time sleeping when it was light out, and it definitely messed up rhythms and that type of thing. So I can sort of empathize to a point. I guess my apartment was my own little cocoon under the sea to some extent, I guess. But and then the other aspect was sort of biological factors when it comes. They were talking about underwater, the bacteria and fungi grow at an accelerated rate, so keeping things sterile and managing skin infections and that type of thing is sort of a battle as well. So we think it's as simple as sending humans down there in a pressurized environment, but there's definitely these sort of like psychological and biological factors that really can mess with us, right? Back to this idea that we're not really made to live under the water the same as the dolphins, right, and the whales, as it were.
No, and that's that's the reality. We need to understand there's an incredible amount of safety concerns and training, right? When you go down into these habitats, and I don't think that's ever going to change. These you have to understand the environment that you're going into, right? And you have to be careful about the decisions that you make when you're down there, right? We can get a little bit more into that. One thing I wanted to say is I might have said hydrogen, but it's really nitrogen. I don't know what if I said hydrogen or nitrogen. I sometimes get those mixed up. So it's really nitrogen buildup, right? Nitrogen bubbles in your blood and stuff. So I just wanted to clarify that. In case any divers will catch me on that. So we can talk a little bit about the Deep Sentinel system. Like I said, it's looking at the 200 meter level. So that's a practical, continental shelf habitat for scientists to study on the ocean floor, but really on the continental shelf side of the ocean floor. And this is really a very incredible piece of engineering that they're building here. The idea is that this is going to be a modular design. It's going to be able to support 6 to 50 people. And when we get into how this is going to be how it is being manufactured, because they're actually designing and building it now. They're looking to deploy it in 2027. Whether or not that project actually happens in 2027, we'll see what happens. But they're actually doing the equivalent of 3D welding, right, or 3D print with a welding so they have robot arms and they weld and they basically leave a strip of fused, deposit fused metal, and then they do another strip and another strip, and they build up these structures following this kind of a 3D design. So it's essentially like 3D printing. The idea, of course, is you have this metal that is essentially, the welding process. It's an integral melting form, right? So you're not going to end up with it's going to be quite strong. You're going to end up with weaknesses or air pockets or in some kind of foreign substance or anything like that. It's essentially a very controlled process, and that makes it that much stronger. And you can also build it thinner, right? The idea is that the hull doesn't have to be as thick if it's definitely a structure that has been basically it's a matter of building precision, right? That's what it is. the more precise of the material that you can build with, the higher capability you have. And of course, when you build these structures, I mean, they're not going to build them for 200 meters, right? They're going to build them for 1.5 to 2 times that. So they're going to be building that, and that's kind of your safety, right? Safety margin. So they're building them really for 400 meters or 300 meters, right? With the intent, of course, that over time, right, you have the process of that everything weakens, right? You take a plane, and Metalfoot taking a plane, that's why they retire the planes after 20 years, or depending on the plane. Right?
Well, it weakens under the pressure and just over time, right? We talked a little bit about that in the exploration episode, right? Where they said they send down, James Cameron's unit or sub or whatever you want to call it that he sent down. When they brought it back, it actually kind of shrunk by like an inch, the immense pressure over time, right? So you can imagine if you have a habitat that's not just going down and exploring, but is sitting there more permanently, you definitely need something that's going to be more resilient. And then if you have the flexibility of materials, then you can build something like aesthetically that's easier to sort of manage, and you can have different formats. Like you don't have to live in a steel tube, right? In a very thick steel tube underwater. You can build these more flexible structures and whatnot, right? So I think it's interesting that we're exploring, different means to which to build these and to sort of, extend the amount of time that, people can, I guess, live and explore underwater and that type of thing. But it's definitely something that they're going to expand on more and more over time, I would imagine, as well, right? And just kind of the idea of building, I don't know, I guess for us it's more temporary habitats of just like being a tourist, but then for scientists and others that want to stay down there and learn and explore and experiment, it's a whole different purpose, right? It's like deep space, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and you have to be, like you said, self-sustainable, but like you can't really like store waste and transport to the surface. You can't inject it into the ocean. You think about the different waste we create as humans, right? And so there's this concept of like a bioreactor to handle all the waste, right? And being able to break it down and then use it, to sort of power different things, or for hydroponics or aquaponics systems, for example, right? I thought it was like that idea of like recycling waste and using it to like help kind of perpetuate life, as it were, within that unit is kind of interesting, because you kind of have to think in those terms, right? Or else it just becomes like unsustainable even from like a financial point of view. But when I was reading about that, it made me think about how they converted the DeLorean in Back to the Future. When Doc went to the future, in the past they had to go find plutonium, right, which was very rare in 1956. When he went to the future, he modified it so that he could put trash in it. Remember?
Mr. Fusion. That was beautiful.
Mr. Fusion, And Marty was like, "What are you doing?" Like, he's like, "Oh, I created this Mr. Fusion." He's just putting banana peels and things like that.
What killed me is he poured the pop, and then he dropped the can in.
Yeah, he dropped the cans.
That was classic. That was just classic. A
lot more efficient than tracking down plutonium and stealing it from whomever, right? That was the whole opening where they came back anyway. So I don't know how we got to the Back to the Future here, but maybe the idea of bioreactors made me think of Back to the Future anyway.
One thing we should do is, we talked about submerged habitats, but we should really take a look at what's going on the ocean surface as well, because there's some amazing advancements there.
Floating habitats.
Floating cities, very large floating structures. That's what we got going on now.
Is this like Waterworld? Is this like Kevin Costner? What's going on here?
It's a modern Waterworld. It's because Kevin Costner's his sunk, didn't it? It's sunk a couple times.
Oh, I don't know, but it was the most. I think we already covered that somewhere in the podcast. It was one of the most expensive flops ever made in cinema history, I think.
Yeah. But the idea was, you want to build something and then have it sink, right? So these things that what I'm talking about here, for instance, let's look at Maldives, right? There's Maldives floating city in Maldives. Now, if you know anything about Maldives, they're only a few feet above sea level, right, as it stands now.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they're literally a beach, you know, and you know, a big wave will wash right over top of them, right? There's a few islands in Maldives that are really, you know, very densely populated. And other than that, it's just a whole collection of smaller islands. And really, you know, with sea levels rising, Maldives might not even be there in the future. So this makes sense. Yeah. You know, Maldives looking at, can we build some kind of floating structures, you know, that can contain or support our population. And they did some interesting engineering. They modeled the particular project they're looking at. They're looking at targeting like 5,000 of these structural units, and with that, they're kind of modeling within this ring of islands, kind of the brain coral structure, which is they believe that's that particular structure breaks up waves and calms the seas really well, and kind of absorbs the impact of directional waves, right? So
yeah, you could see that with its like sort of geometry, right? It's definitely created in such a way to sort of like probably break up the natural like rhythm of waves and so on, right? So like when waves crash on the shore, and this is sort of the same idea. It looks like it's sort of creating something that for the waves to sort of like bump into, as it were, right?
Yeah. Now, akin to this, in Busan, South Korea, there's something called Oceanics City. It's 6.3 hectare of hexagonal platforms, so 6-sided platforms. So basically, they're modeling the beehive, right? And what they want to do with these platforms, each platform would be 300 plus residents or 300 homes, right? And they want to moor each one of these to the ocean floor. So they're building these out, and they're connecting them, right? And the intent is to ultimately be able to house 12,000 people, right? They're building these particular platforms out of sustainable materials, and with the intent to integrate, you know, sea life, you know, working with, you know, catching sea life and sea farms, and also having particular types of grow industries supported just under the surface, so scallops and kelp and fish and so on. And it's actually, you know, the intent there is to have a completed platform by 2026, fully self-sufficient, solar power, water recycling, being able to generate their own type of food using aeroponics and hydroponics. And
that's the interesting part. Is like the self-sufficient part of it. I think is really interesting, that we're not just building like a floating structure, but we're thinking about how to make this very much self-sufficient. Whether that's, you know, power, like you said, water, food. I mean, those are really the basics that we need. You know, when it really comes down to it, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's a good kind of look at how, you know, we can create more sustainable cities, and I guess it's maybe like a little bit easier to do on the water, right? Because you have access to, you know, biomaterials and other things. You have access to water, obviously, that you need to figure out how to, you know, recycle or reuse and what have you. But when you think about the future of humanity and how much the sea levels are rising, and how much, you know, whatever your beliefs are, we know that the climate is changing, that there are sea levels rising. There's, you know, things are melting in the Arctic. We see that happening more and more. Like, land is really going to be the scarcity, right? That we've always sort of like assumed that we're going to live on the land and there's enough land. And certainly there's a lot of land, available. But some countries are very densely packed with people, right? They have small landmass. Like look at, say, like India, for example, right? How many millions of people are in that small, relatively small landmass of India compared to the landmass of Canada, and how many people are here? Now, not all of Canada's landmass is necessarily habitable either, right? In the Arctic or different areas or what have you. But this idea of creating a system or an ecosystem where you can live on the water and it be self-sustaining is interesting. When you go to their website, it says like "Welcome to the future of humanity." So apparently that's the future, Patrick. We're all going to live on the water and with Kevin Costner, I guess.
Well, I think for countries that are currently living on the water, this is just a means of a transition means into, these platforms, these technologically advanced platforms that are floating islands, essentially made of concrete and what they call biorock, right? They're essentially, they use steel and concrete, and they run current through, and it pulls in minerals from the water, and this creates an outer shell that's super, super hard, and it's very buoyant, right? And it's that the trick is to be able to have a floating platform that can float for hundreds of years, right? We're not talking about a ship, sailing through the seas and getting dry docked and getting, maintained every few years, right? We're talking about a something so big you can't even do that, right? It's got to be able to handle, the additional weight along its bottoms as sea growth attaches to it, and you also have to look at, okay, how do you repel some of that as well, where you don't want it. So there's a lot of technologies around that they're developing, as well as, the biggest problem, this is the ironic part, is when you're out in the middle of the ocean, right, where do you get your fresh water, right? Do you pull it from the air, or do you process it from the salt water around you? And, utilizing, solar technologies, and that can give you the power to run those two types of methods. But there are passive methods for both. So we'll see where they end up with, from a point of view of large commercial operations to create these systems. But the also the idea of integrating itself, right, with the environment, with the ocean environment, and that also includes handling extreme storms, right, extreme weather. You'll be out in the middle of the ocean, you're getting these, significant waves and significant swells. You got to be able to have a structure that can not break but bend with it, and at the same time still maintain a level of integrity through the most, intense weather.
Yeah, they seem to be building some of these, like this one, Ocean X. They're building sort of in an area that's a little bit sheltered from the sea in a sense, right? Like it's kind of like they're extending the city out into the bay. It kind of looks like, right? Interestingly enough, like, the estimates is that, back to what we were talking about, and, climate and change and whatnot, like, by the middle of the century, by one estimate, 800 million people will live in cities where the sea level could rise by more than half a meter. And many coastal neighborhoods already regularly flood. So, I mean, it's interesting that, like, in this technology, as the sea level rises, so will the neighborhood, right? So it conforms to even, like, not just like what you said, which was the weather, but it also conforms as the sea levels rise, right? This part of the city is going to rise up and up with it. And then that's going to be prime real estate, right? What about the rest of the people that aren't on the floating island? Everybody's going to want onto the floating island at some point, right?
Right,
I'll probably expand that out over time, but it's just a reality for people that don't want to move or can't move, right? That they need to start thinking about these. There's a lot. I mean, 800 million people in cities where the sea level could rise. And half a meter doesn't sound like a lot in your mind, but a half a meter is very significant when you're living at sea level.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And the idea, of course, is once you build these, right, they're going to become their own type of, destination. People are going to go there, and if you build them well, right, you're going to be able to support things like tourism, right? You're going to be able to support, a floating airport, right? The ability to have an influx of population and still manage it, right? So we're at the beginning of that phase where, and I think it's very important for the smaller nations to start seriously thinking about this and what they are going to do, because in the end, why wait for the inevitable? Why wait for the water to wash over their island? Like, do something, right? There's a couple other ones that are occurring. There's Saudi Arabia is building something called Oxagon, and they're kind of spreading out from the shore and into the bay, like we had mentioned. And the intent is to have over 90,000 residents living in that area, and it's going to be both, on the ocean and also on land. So it's kind of a hybrid situation. There's something called the Blue Estate Group, and this is in the Caribbean where they're looking to build this. Now this is a little different story. It's the same in a way that they want to create themselves a massive floating island, right? But what they're also doing here is they're looking to create their own country per se, right?
Okay.
They're gonna have their own government, their own country, their own tax-free. They start looking at tax-free havens, right, and setting up banks and financial institutions there. What's the incentive here? You know where it is. It's basically they're trying to make this, the haven for the ultra rich.
I think that's probably a legitimate concern people have. I mean, there's one thing about building, habitats for a lot of areas where they're sort of underprivileged and are going to end up underwater, as opposed to like you said, the Blue Estate Group building this luxury floating man-made island. So when all the land floods, it's really the people with the wealth and the means that are going to end up in these floating cities. If we really want to take it to extreme, let's just say in the future, all the polar caps have melted and the Earth becomes a water world. I mean, these are going to be the people that survive, right?
Yeah, I mean, even if everything melted, I mean, what is it, 120 feet or something like that? It's. I mean, there's a lot of land that's going to be flooded, of course.
We're talking science fiction here, right? We're talking the aliens come in and they dump a whole bunch of water on the planet and try to drown us all.
Yeah, we're not talking water world here, is it? We're not. But a significant amount of land and a significant amount of southern island chains will be underwater. Yes, and I think it's time for those particular islands to have a 50-year plan to start looking at the future and start planning for the future, because these types of projects take millions of dollars, millions and billions of dollars, and many years to develop. And that's just to develop the platforms, never mind the technologies to support the population, and also to have that, your first one out there you're going to build may not necessarily work. It may have problems, right? And you have to refine, right, as you go, and continue to, improve those habitats, which is something that, in the end, if you have a starting point, and you have the time, by the time we do see we're talking beyond 2050. We see this significant deluge sea level rise, we're going to be able to have this, what we consider misplaced millions of people. They will have a destination. They're not going to be, it's going to be planned versus a disaster, right?
Exactly.
So the other side of this, of course, is Blue Estate Group is all about, like you said, it's the ultra rich doing what they want to do and making things on their terms. They're going to have this massive 160-foot exterior walls out for oceans and ocean hurricanes and everything. We're talking about a kind of a fortress on the water.
Well, yeah, not just walls to keep the water out, but to keep the people out, to keep the sea pirates out, right?
Sea pirates.
The people that want to come in there and like rob the place. I mean, if the average mansion on this thing is $1 billion, there's going to be a lot of rich people in there and a lot of wealth. There's going to be people that are going to want to get in there and get a piece of that, right?
Yeah.
As well, I would imagine, right? It's just kind of an interesting like dichotomy of needing that habitat to protect yourself in many ways, I suppose, right?
Yeah. They're talking about some apartments you can get there for $15,000, but we'll see what really happens. There's going to be the low-paid, guy that handles the sewage, right?
He's got to live somewhere.
He's got to work, so he's going to have to work on the island.
You're going to have the Uber drivers and everybody else on there. Food.
Yeah. So all these people will have to have a place to live, and of course you have your airports and you have your seaports, all part of. And this thing will have to be, basically moored to the ocean floor, of that significant weight.
That's a lot.
Yeah, you're going to have many different.
You sort of have to build your own sort of like community or ecosystem, right? If you think about like many years ago, I went on a trip to Hollywood, California, right? And toward Warner Brothers Studios. And they take you on this like little cart thing and like golf cart type thing. And maybe it was a bit bigger, but essentially at the Warner Brothers Studios, they take you around the whole place. And what the guy described there was that this place is like a self-contained city. When you're in there, you think, oh, this is like a movie set, right? But it actually needs to function sort of like a city in a strange way. In fact, it has its own fire department, has its own police department, right? It has all these, because it's really a replica. When you're walking around, you feel like you're walking around a city, but it's all fake, and inside a lot of these buildings are sets with lights, but when you're there, you feel like you're in your city, and that was what the guy said, right? It's like we actually have like our own fire department here, because it's like when there's a fire, like trying to get an exterior fire department into this huge complex in time, when you have gates that are, that keep people out, right? In essence, right? That you have to go through and pay to take a tour. Like, it's just not practical for them to bring in outside. So I think they're going to have to basically recreate the entire ecosystem of a city inside of this floating kind of structure, right? Of like police, fire, ambulance, hospital. Like you're not going to want to have to airlift somebody off every time something happens, or you're not going to be able to bring in, a water bomber to put out a house fire. You're going to have to. It's more than just building like a floating set of structures. It's building like a whole thing on the water. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I think what this, I'm looking at the designs of this thing, which are something like a cross, big thick cross with arrow shapes on it. One thing it's missing, of course, is a harbor, right? Because I do think that they'll need to have a protected area for docking on the outside for their ships that will be used to maintain the outer parts of the ocean, right? And also for, basically you're going to need this similar, deep sea tugboats, right? Similar type of technology there to help guide big ships in and that kind of thing, and connect up. So I do see that, but even this particular plan, where they're talking about, I don't know how many thousands of meters here we're talking about, but there's got to be some kind of actual limitation to the size of these floating islands. And like I said, you're basically tying these, mooring these to the ocean floor. And if you have all these at different tensions, right, and then you have a significant storm, you could tear apart the structure, right? So there's probably a limit to what you can do, and then you have to create another island, right? And then you connect the two islands. I think. I mean, I'm not a special undersea oversea engineer, but I would suspect that's the case. So, but going back to your discussion here about these are cities on water. Well, the other side of the coin right now are cruise ships, right?
Yes.
And ships that are significant in size. I mean, whether it be a aircraft carrier or what is level massive cruise ships of today. They're cities. They're cities on the water, and there are plans out there where they're basically the intent is to have people will buy a room and pay an annual fee, and they'll have permanent apartments on these ships, and these ships will be going from one port to another, eventually circumnavigating the planet, but doing it and having longer stays. They would harbor for a while, then they would basically transit over to another harbor. There is on the docket, somebody has said, well, let's just make a mega ship, right? Let's just make something called the Freedom Ship.
Sure.
And it's, the idea being it's going to accommodate 60,000 people, right? It's going to take $10 billion to build. It's going to be 1 mile long. It's going to be 25 stories high. It's going to have its own airport on the roof, right?
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So, why not? It's, if you're going to, and if you have a big ship like that, you can have these great big apartments too, right? However, is it going to sink? The Titanic was never supposed to sink, but it did, didn't it? And it's a few miles down, right? So
yeah,
you might be 24 stories high, and you might be this massive ship, but it can get swallowed up pretty quick. So I personally, I think there needs to be some serious engineering around making an unsinkable ship before I consider setting foot in something like that.
Well, not just setting foot, but living in it, right? And living on it. But I mean, some people are cut out for that life. I know my late mother. She went
Your
on
late
many,
mom?
yeah, went on many cruises across the world,
Yeah.
like all through.
Yeah.
Would leave like Florida and go all overseas and Rome and Greece and Italy and different countries, and just she lived on cruise ships for a fair bit of her retirement and just absolutely loved it, right? I mean, I could have seen her living on a cruise ship permanently. That would probably be about her speed, So I think it's some things are for people, some things are not, but there's a certain portion. Obviously, the cruise industry is huge, but this is different. There's one thing going into a cruise and then coming back, right? It's one thing to
it's like a
have that
4 week thing, and then
it's like was it a 3-hour cruise? We all know what happened in Gilligan's Island.
Poor Gilligan
Didn't turn out too well, but but I mean it's interesting in the sense that there is a fair bit of landmass, but like how much of it is actually like desirable to live on, and how much of it has the right resources or infrastructure, right? And so this whole idea though of I think living on the water is certainly a lot more practical than living underneath the water, right? We talked a lot about underwater habitats, which are largely for science, right? But also there is some leisure there, right? There's hotels where you can walk down and you have a room under the water type thing, right? But practically for more permanent living, I think you are talking about like a floating city and maybe a permanent type ship and that type of thing. But we're certainly venturing into that sort of alternate timeline where much of humanity may start living on the water for reasons like we talked about, right? For like rising waters, but also like trying to adapt. If you look at like part of one of the most expensive real estate areas in Manhattan, New York, is sitting on water that essentially will, if things rise a half a meter, it's all underwater.
They're all
right?
underwater, yeah.
And so and then,
Don't take this
say,
way.
Yeah. You could say people could move, but people are very attached to their home, to their culture, to their country, wherever they are. Not everybody wants to move. So if we can even retrofit things or extend out cities in ways that will prevent that and give people an option, I think it's kind of important, right?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is the process of building systems that are there to handle over a long term, handle the needs of ourselves. It's a learning process, of course, but the technologies, like I talked about this process of 3D printing by welding, right? And they got laser welding and standard welding, electrical welding, but that's what we're getting into, right? It's forcing industry, other than war. I've said that before, to be more innovative, right? It's new materials, new processes, new invention, new creations, right? And this is a good thing, right? The act of exploration of the deep, right, forces us to expand, right? Expand our knowledge set, expand in our capabilities, expand in our basically our we'll say imagination, right? Our ability to say, how can we solve almost an unsolvable problem, right? And that's the beauty of it, right? And that's why I'm fully behind a flight to Mars. I'm fully behind setting up moon bases. I believe that is where mankind should be focusing their efforts, and that is exciting, right? That is hopeful for the next generation, right? When we talk about war and fighting over oil and what have you, that's a negative thing. That's not a positive thing. The idea of exploration, the idea of setting foot where no man has set foot before, the Star Trek thing. Yeah. That's what really we should be doing, right? That's our nature. That's what we should be doing. And there's going to be people who are less apt, less heroic. They don't want to put themselves into jeopardy. And there's going to be the people who are saying, let's do it, right? And I might die, right? I might not make it. But we're going to make as much, or put as much engineering as we can around this situation that, it will be difficult, right? to die, right? And that
for sure, yeah.
That's what we got to do, right?
But I have to ask though. I have a question, Patrick.
Sure.
How much of our soul are we willing to trade for a permanent seat at the bottom of the ocean?
Thank you for listening to the Probability Podcast. Please join us next time for more musings from the generator and the discriminator.